Hi, I'm Christy Bowman, and I'm a Science Content Specialist at the Ohio Resource Center for Mathematics, Science, and Reading, more commonly known as ORC. Joining me today are two outstanding classroom teachers and a representative from the Ohio Department of Education. Sarah Quart is an excellent high school science teacher with 10 years of experience from Thomas Worthington High School, and David Quart is also joining us as a special education teacher with 7 years of experience from Thomas Worthington High School. Sarah and David co-teach an inclusion classroom, and they will be sharing their unique experiences and instructional strategies with us. Susan Wilson is joining us as a licensed middle school science teacher and has worked as a representative from the Ohio Department of Education's Office for Exceptional Children for 15 years. All of our participants have expertise working in the science inclusion classroom and have many helpful ideas and strategies that both new and experienced teachers will find useful. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm very excited to be a part of this podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
I know there are a lot of science teachers out there looking for information on how to teach students with special needs in the science classroom. This podcast focuses on some of the most effective and often used instructional strategies that may be used with special needs students and highlights some of the types of resources found in the Special Needs Students in the Science Classroom section of the New Teacher Survival Guide. It's also important to note that each science classroom is unique. This podcast focuses on many of the strategies and adaptations used frequently and effectively in many science classrooms. But even so, the adaptations and strategies that work in one classroom may not be appropriate for another. Keep this in mind throughout the podcast.
Yes, and likewise, each student with a disability is unique and has specific needs. The strategies and adaptations that work with one student may not work for another. That is why it is so important to know the student and for teachers to familiarize themselves with the needs and interventions outlined in the student's individualized education plan, or commonly known as the IEP.
So let's go from there and talk about some of the strategies that immediately come to mind when thinking about science inclusion classrooms that may help both regular and special education students succeed. Some of the topics and strategies within those topics that we'll be discussing are the classroom environment, co-teaching, grouping, and technology. Let's start off by talking about the classroom environment. In the classroom setting, seating arrangements for both the regular and special needs students are crucial. Sarah, how do you approach the seating arrangements in your classroom?
Well, we place students around the room in a way that lends to access, really. Any students that have trouble taking notes, focusing, or organizing their paperwork, we tend to seat them near the front of the room, the back of the room, or along an aisle. So this allows David or I to quickly see if the student has the correct materials out and that they're writing the things down that they're supposed to. Basically, it just allows us a quicker access to these students.
I agree with Sarah in that students must be easily accessible. I think there are two key factors that affect the seating arrangement: proximity and distractibility. Proximity to the teacher, proximity to other students, and proximity to instructional materials are all factors to consider. Often it is important for me as the teacher to be in close proximity to the student who needs to be monitored for understanding or for escalating behaviors. I have found that moving in close to a student who needs redirection or lightly touching his or her work is generally more effective than verbal prompting. For some students with disabilities who have balance or motor problems or low vision, the amount of movement required to attain materials can be an obstacle. For others, being too close to the materials serves as a distraction. Almost everything, the door, the windows, the lighting, the heat source, buzzing light fixtures, where you place your smartboard, the word wall, can all serve as a help to some students and a distraction for others.
These are some great ideas on how to arrange your students in the classroom. Let's continue talking about the classroom environment. I know you are all very deliberate in creating the environment that your students learn best in. Can you talk about what is special about your inclusion classrooms and what makes it easy for both the regular and the special needs students learn? Susan, would you like to start us off?
Sure. My classroom environment could probably best be described as structured chaos. Structure came in the form of high expectations for all students based on the academic standards and a few basic classroom rules. My approach to teaching incorporates the principles of universal design. So flexible presentation of instruction and flexibility in how students express learning, thus the chaos. As far as the physical environment, I think a classroom should be rich in resources, print and electronic media, 3D models and realistic examples of concepts being taught, word walls, examples of student work, and such.
Structured chaos. I like that terminology. Sarah, do you have something you'd like to add to this?
Yes, David and I have really a unique situation where we can create a family type of atmosphere. You can see the look on the kids' faces when we tell them that they have both Mr. and Mrs. Court for science class. David and I joke with each other a lot. We work well together. We play off of each other's ideas and things like that. And this shows the kids that they can relax in a room, they can feel comfortable asking questions, and sometimes even tease us. David, what do you think?
I agree. I think many of the kids ask questions in the class because they see Sarah and I themselves as being relaxed, and that makes them feel a little bit more comfortable and secure to ask us questions. They also know that with two of us being in the room, well, potentially their questions will be answered much faster.
Most of you probably caught in the introductions that Sarah and David co-teach in a high school science inclusion classroom. This is one approach to teaching students in an inclusion classroom that should be tailored to meet student needs, teacher preferences, and curricular demands. This is the case with David and Sarah's classroom, which has a blend of special needs students with learning disabilities along with regular education students. David and Sarah, how have you made co-teaching work in your classroom, and how have you tailored this approach to meet the unique needs of your students?
Well, Sarah and I make sure that we introduce ourselves as the two teachers of the class on the first day of school. We don't introduce the class as, quote-unquote, an inclusion class per se. We don't introduce ourselves as one science teacher and the other the intervention specialist. So the kids have the opportunity to see us as both two science teachers, which provides them a greater opportunity for more support.
So it seems like you work as a team where your students see you both in the same light.
Yes.
David, do you share the planning, the instruction, and the assessment with Sarah?
Yes, we work together on all aspects of teaching the class. Our students see us both as the teachers. One is not necessarily the assistant, one is not the science teacher, one is not the special education teacher. We both take turns discussing topics and or lecturing. We both take turns going over the homework, assigning the labs, or introducing projects. However, of course, this is our fifth year doing this together, so either of us could effectively teach any of the topics, and we have had plenty of time to collaborate.
This sounds like a great team-teaching relationship and fits your situation perfectly. Susan, do you have experience co-teaching? And if so, what do you think other science teachers should know about this approach?
I think science teachers should know that when it comes to students with disabilities, the collaboration is vital, as Sarah and Dave have said. It takes a team to address the specific learning needs of these students. That's why the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, requires that the IEP be a team process. And as much as possible, the regular education teachers involved with that student should be a part of that team. Wouldn't you want the physical therapist to talk to you about a student's problems with balance before you have them carrying a beaker of a specific chemical across the classroom? Addressing team teaching specifically, I've seen many different team teaching configurations in my travels throughout the state. But the common thread that seems to run through all the successful collaborations is shared planning between the regular education teacher and the intervention specialist, and professional dialogue among all the members of the IEP team.
Thanks, Susan, for that information on co-teaching. I agree that collaboration is a huge part of a successful co-teaching experience. Some of the other viable models of co-teaching are one teacher teaching and one assisting. This model is one where both teachers are present, but one of them takes the clear lead as far as delivering the instruction. Station teaching occurs when teachers divide instruction into two segments and present the content at separate locations within the classroom. Teachers teach half of the material and then trade student groups and repeat the same instruction. And the last model of co-teaching is parallel teaching that occurs when students are separated into two blended groups of students, and each teacher delivers the same content, but using different instructional strategies and approaches according to the needs of the students in their group. It's also important to note that many experienced co-teachers use many approaches to co-teaching, sometimes even within a single lesson, or even adapt these approaches to meet specific situations that come up in the classroom setting. If we can continue on, I know you all keep your students actively involved in your classes by having students take part in various hands-on activities. What do you do for your students that may have a hard time taking part in a specific hands-on activity because of their special needs? Susan, could you give us some insight into this?
This is a difficult question to respond to. There was an article in Science Scope in 1994 in which Richardson wrote, "Excusing a special needs student from an assignment is simply excusing yourself from finding a way for the student to participate in the assignment." I think it's my responsibility as a teacher to explore every possibility to find a way for every student in my class to participate by providing a different entry point, different learning task, or providing them with assistive technology support or paired student support. Plus, the research has shown that hands-on learning experiences are very effective with many students, regardless of their type of disability. So I would not want to exclude them from it, if at all possible.
I agree, Susan. Teachers have got to take the responsibility for finding a way for every student to participate, no matter what their disability is. Sometimes that can be pretty challenging. Let's move on and talk about the lab setting in a science classroom, and start by talking about putting together lab groups. This needs to be done in a very deliberate way, no matter what type of classroom you teach in. I'd like to ask Sarah to start off by answering the following question. What do you think about when you're deciding which students to group with one another?
Well, one thing we consider is grouping students really based on their personality, like one extrovert with one introvert. We have found over the years that you could have two students of the same ability working together, but it's really not going to work if they're both shy or they're not going to talk to each other. Nothing gets done in the lab. David, what do you think?
Along with personality, we also take group size into account. The size of our groups changes based on the activity. Sometimes we have detailed activities that require the kids to be with just one other person. Other times, however, we have group activities where I could take half of the class and Sarah could take the other half. This helps with explanation and understanding of activities with labs.
It sounds like you're using flexible grouping, which frequently changes based on the complexity of the content, student interest, and student learning style. Sarah, how do you feel about assigning roles to students in their groups based on their abilities?
Good science teachers do this. Whether you teach enriched or lower functioning students, it really doesn't matter. It's really important to make each student feel like they have a purpose in the lab group. By assigning roles to students, they feel like they are contributing, they have a purpose and a goal.
David?
If we often don't see our students engaged as our expectations, we'll provide impromptu roles. I'll occasionally go around and monitor students and ask questions to the group and make sure that each person is responsible for a role, whether that be a timekeeper, an announcer, or a sharing of data, or a recording of the data.
Great idea. What adaptations have you made for students that have problems reading and or following experimental or laboratory directions?
We try to have students work through their readings or work with their lab partners individually to gain a better understanding. Often it is supportive where we can reteach the material at another or later point in time in a learning center to make sure that our students have gained the concepts that they're expected to read.
It sounds like you're encouraging collaboration.
Yes, an important quality to keep in mind when implementing inquiring in the classroom.
We also find that with more intense instructions, we get a lot of searching for clarification from the students. So we'll try to have as much of the lab ready to go as possible prior to doing the lab itself.
I would also like to add that ORC has a number of resources that have written transcripts as well as audio and video clips available that provide reinforcement for questions that students may have. For example, we have resources on dissection that provide step-by-step written instructions, but what makes these resources unique are the video and the audio clips and images that are available to assist those who need reinforcement or for those students whose disabilities limit them from doing the actual dissection. I'd also like to discuss technology that is available for students with special needs. And if we can dig a little deeper, let's talk about technology that is available for students with sensory impairments that would help a student in the science laboratory. Susan, could you share some of your knowledge on this topic with us?
Absolutely. Technology is a highly effective tool for putting students with disabilities on an equal playing field with their typically developing peers. Educational and assistive technologies can help a student to compensate for lack of motor skills, sensory skills, lack of communication skills, and cognitive skills. And as far as students with sensory impairments, so much technology has been developed to assist students with sensory impairments. There are talking scales, talking thermometers, liquid level indicators, digital microscopes, classroom amplification systems, screen readers, and on and on. We also have a local resource in Ohio, the Ohio School for the Blind Outreach Program, that provides technical assistance for districts that serve students with visual impairments. And the Ohio Center for Autism and Low Incidence, also known as OCALI, provides technical assistance in assistive technologies. And there are simple things that you can do in the classroom as well, like using black-backed or raised markings on measuring instruments, making sure that visually impaired students have been oriented to the room and the materials, both very important. In my class, all classroom materials and equipment were given specific permanent homes, and all were labeled with Braille and large print text. On lab days, each group retrieved a bin that contained the basic supplies used in most of our experiments, like the plastic test tubes and holders, plastic beakers, hot plates, tongs, talking thermometers, etc., which I then supplemented with additional equipment or supplies needed for that specific day. I found this organized approach to material handling to be very helpful for all of my students, but particularly for those with low vision or cognitive deficits.
Those are some great ideas to assist students with special needs in the science laboratory. For additional suggestions on ways to adapt your science laboratory, go to ORC resource number 12174, 20 Ways to Adapt the Science Lab. Let's move on and talk about other educational approaches, adaptations, or strategies that our panelists have used that have had a positive impact on students' learning and may be appropriate for other classrooms as well. Susan, would you like to start off?
Sure. I see universal design for learning as an educational approach that encompasses different research-based strategies for designing curriculum so that specific adaptations are not needed. Similarly, differentiated instruction is also an approach to instruction that encompasses many different research-based strategies to match to the individual student's need. If you remember back to our previous dissection example, we outlined some great strategies to differentiate instruction by having some students complete online dissections while other students in your class were doing actual real-time dissections. We might further differentiate instruction by providing a Braille-labeled plastic model or digital magnification enhancement for the students with visual impairments. If we were to apply UDL principles or Universal Design for Learning principles here, we would design our curriculum to include those online dissections with on-screen magnification for all of our students rather than planning for the real-time dissection. And that would allow all of our students with motor or visual impairment to participate from the beginning without any further adaptation from the teacher. That said, both of these approaches, UDL and differentiated instruction, as well as all the individual strategies that have been outlined, have merit when teaching students with disabilities. One strategy that I use is to develop teaching activities that are multisensory, engaging as many pathways of learning at one time as possible when I get all those synapses firing and connecting. That way I am likely to engage each student's strength area in completing the activity. For example, when learning the skeletal system, I introduced the scientific names of individual bones with the old Dem Bones song. The femur is connected to the patella. Patella is connected to the tibia. You probably started humming or thinking it if you know the song. Even today, you'd be surprised how many students have heard that song. Is it engaging, motivating, connect to prior learning of common bone names, rhythmical, musical, auditory, kinesthetic? Yes, yes, and yes, and it's fun. And then to add a visual component, I list the bones in the order they come in the song on the board and post a picture of the actual bones between the common name and the scientific name. This really helps students to make connections to previous learning. I guess you can tell it really jazzes me up as the teacher when I can incorporate all of these wonderful strategies to engage all of my students in learning.
Thank you for sharing those ideas, Susan. I hope our listeners will use some of them in their classrooms. Sarah, what strategies do you use with your class?
Well, first of all, if and when my students take notes, I try to make my PowerPoints very colorful. I try to highlight the words they need to be writing down to emphasize their importance. I also try to relate science concepts and terms to their lives, which makes learning more real to them, more authentic. David has also taught me over the years to use a little better judgment on my wait time.
I agree. I think wait time and relating science concepts to students' lives can only positively affect students' science process skills and their understanding of science. David, what strategies and or adaptations would you like to add?
Sarah and I are constantly teaching and modeling for our students that if they don't necessarily know the answer right away, they should at least know how to find the resource to get the answer. We try to put them in the role of the scientist. What would a scientist do if they didn't know the answer?
Thank you to all of our panelists for those great strategies or adaptations. We've already talked about many of the topics covered in resources found in the Special Needs Students section of the New Teacher Survival Guide. However, there is one resource that I would encourage you to take a look at while we are discussing it if you have access to a computer. ORC resource number 12178, Science Inquiry, the link to accessing the general education curriculum, is an excellent resource. This provides an in-depth look at what scientific inquiry looks like and explains why it's particularly important for teaching and learning science. One of the most useful parts of this resource explains how inquiry benefits students with special needs and gives some excellent strategies to support students with special needs for each phase of inquiry. David, can you start by talking about why inquiry is important for teaching and learning science, especially in an inclusion classroom?
Well, any best practice activity that is hands-on, minds-on, taking students out of their seats is important. Many of our inclusion students have a difficult time focusing as is, let alone if we were to ask them to sit for a full 50 minutes and just listen to a lecture. So we try to incorporate a lot of generating and testing hypotheses. This gets them a little bit more excited and interested in what's next.
What do you think, Susan?
I agree. Inquiry learning is very empowering to students. That feeling that they hold the power to solving not only their own problems, but maybe even those that threaten us as a population, as a planet. It boosts self-confidence and lets students know, yes, you can do science. It's all around us. That is especially important for some of the students with disabilities that have not had any past success or have even been given any opportunity to show success in the area of science.
I agree. When students are put into the role of the scientist, it can be very empowering. Susan, can you talk about which form of inquiry, structure, guided, open, or even a combination that has worked best in your classroom as far as helping both the regular and the special needs students succeed?
I think you have to look for balance, from teacher-led to student-led. I think it has to be a dynamic process based on the specific content, comfort level of the teacher, and the needs of your students. The key to me is flexibility in presentation, engagement, and assessment, and that should include options for inquiry, structured, guided, and open.
I couldn't agree more. Sarah, would you point out one strategy that has helped to support students with special needs in your inquiry-based science inclusion classroom?
We have students form hypotheses all the time. I really think this allows kids to feel that they can contribute to the class activities, even if they're unsure of the content of the topic.
Well, I'd like to add that in that I try to make this into a large class survey. I'll write the hypothesis on the board and pick a few kids to ask why. This gets the kids thinking, and they're usually pretty then eager to share their ideas.
Good idea. Do you do this throughout your class, or would this strategy work best during a specific phase of the inquiry process?
I think it would work best at the beginning phase of the inquiry process, the setting up of the experiment or the setting up of the activity.
Along with the many strategies provided for students with special needs, I would also like to add that this resource has a great section on problems that special needs students may have during each phase of the inquiry process. Being made aware of these possible difficulties makes the detection of them that much easier. ORC resource number 12178, Science Inquiry, the link to accessing the general education curriculum, is just one example of the types of resources that you will find in the Special Needs Students in the Science Classroom section of the New Teacher Survival Guide. For additional resources focusing on special needs students in the science classroom, go to the Special Needs Students in the Science Classroom section of the New Teacher Survival Guide on ORC's website or you can use the search feature to look for lessons at www.ohioRC.org. I would like to thank Sarah and David Quart and Susan Wilson for joining me for today's podcast focusing on the special needs students in the science classroom section of the New Teacher Survival Guide.
We'd like to thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks for having me, and thanks to ORC for all of the resources that you provide to all of Ohio's science teachers.
We hope this has been helpful to other teachers who share similar situations.
Don't forget to check out the resources that supplement this podcast by going to the Science Educators page on ORC's website and clicking on New Teacher Survival Guide. For the Ohio Resource Center, I'm Christy Bowman, hoping you gain some insight into strategies and adaptations that can be used with special needs students in the science classroom, as well as the types of resources found in the Special Needs Students in the Science Classroom section of the New Teacher Survival Guide.